Greetings, friends of liberty. In 1973, 53 years ago, this May, Ayn Rand published an essay entitled The Missing Link in her biweekly newsletter called the Ayn Rand Letter. Then, 9 years later, this essay was one of many included in her 1982 book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Not surprisingly, Yaron Brook, present chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, on December 14th, 2025, claimed that the theory outlined by Rand in this essay explains why reason collapses and tribalism takes over. In other words, the psychology behind America's dissent. Ambitious claims indeed. Is Brook right? Did Miss Rand really in one essay identify the nature of tribalism and the emergence of tribal communities? And show that this is the fundamental, foundational reason for America's dissent? In order to see, let's review Rand's essay and then evaluate how much philosophic water Rand's and Brooks's claims can hold. She begins by giving, from her own experience with friends and acquaintances, 4 putative examples of tribalists. In each case, for psychological reasons, she argues the people fail to draw conclusions about the world around them, conclusions which seem obvious. She claims that while the circumstances and the people in these 4 examples are different, the type of mentality they display is the same. It is self-made, but many different factors can contribute, social or personal. These cases are examples of the anti-conceptual mentality. The anti-conceptual mentality. How does she define it? The main characteristic is a special kind of passivity. Not passivity as such, and not across the board, but passivity beyond a certain limit. In other words, passivity in regard to the process of conceptualization, and therefore in regard to fundamental principles. It is a mentality which decided at a certain point of development that it knows enough and does not care to look further. To such a mentality, everything is the given. The passage of time, the 4 seasons, the institution of marriage, the weather. The fact that most everything, whether the man-made or the metaphysical, is taken as a given means that, according to Ayn, these people stop asking A, why something is the way it is, and B, what any given man-made object is used for. In other words, they stop caring about understanding both causality and human purpose. Rand believes that these people are properly called concrete bound because she believes that their psychology remains at an inappropriately perceptual level. What are the alleged consequences of having this type of mentality? Miss Rand claims that one consequence is that they want to feel safe from the necessity of dealing with fundamental principles and consequently safe from full responsibility for one's own life. But they express this desire for safeness explicitly by feeling dependent and that they want to be safe from outsiders. In other words, she's arguing that A, they feel incompetent to deal with reality because, being anti-conceptual to some degree, they recognize that and sense that they can't function as well in reality. And B, they experience the resulting anxiety as wanting to be safe from outsiders or wanting to be dependent on the people they know. So here we see the proposed causal connection. Again, A, refusal to be appropriately conceptual about the world. B, actual inability to a degree to deal with the world. As a result, this causing anxiety. And C, this feeling translated into a feeling of dependency and wanting to be safe from outsiders. Tribalness. Miss Rand appears to break all tribes down into 2 types. Stone Age tribes, who exist as part of a developmental stage in human civilization, and B, modern tribes. With Stone Age tribes, Rand seems to agree that it's not their fault, they're tribal, since they have very little civilizational knowledge, and so it's not surprising they would band together and be very loyal to one another in the jungle to survive. I would argue that given their low level of knowledge, in their social context, often living among many other, often hostile tribes, their tribalness is rational. Rand says of these tribes, primitive tribes are an obvious example of the anti-conceptual mentality, perhaps with some justification, since savages, like children, are on the preconceptual level of development. However, I think it would be more accurate to call them unconceptual or not conceptual and not anti-conceptual. And that's because of the simple fact that they don't have much conceptual knowledge because of their relatively rudimentary level of civilization doesn't mean they're against conceptualizing. In any case, leaving behind the headhunters of the Amazonas, we're left then with more modern tribes. What does she give as specific examples of these? Racism, xenophobia, any caste system, guild socialism, ancestor worship, extended family and kinship solidarity, and any criminal gang. What is the basic reason, the cause, according to Rand, for the existence of these racist, xenophobic, and other tribal groups? She says the disintegration of philosophy. Tribalism is a product of fear, and fear is the dominant emotion of any person, culture, or society that rejects man's power of survival reason. As philosophy slithered into the primitive swamp of irrationalism, men were driven, existentially and psychologically, into its primordial corollary, tribalism. So here we have it, the essentials of Rand's theory and her alleged missing link between animals and humans. The decline of philosophy has led to human beings becoming more anti-conceptual, and that has led to the rise of various tribes, modern tribes. Is this true? Let's examine the elements of her theory, starting with her example of criminal gangs. Number one, criminal gangs. If we examine Western civilization during the last century, we see, starting with alcohol prohibition in the U.S. in the 1920s, and the drug war ramping up under President Nixon in the 70s, that the enormous increase in the prevalence, power, and violence of these drug gangs and cartels is directly related to the attempt to prohibit the sale of either alcohol or various narcotics. No prohibition, no Al Capone and the South Side Gang. No drug war, no Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. So contrary to Rand's implications, the rise in these criminal gangs as tribal groups is not in the slightest caused by any alleged increase of anti-conceptualization among, let's say, the people in Chicago, Colombia, or Mexico. Instead, it's caused by the enormous profits earned by trading in cocaine, heroin, pot, fentanyl, and meth. These profits caused by the fact that selling these substances is illegal, and thus much more risky. The cause here is the drug war, not anti-conceptualism, which is only a byproduct. Number two, extended family kinships. A second example Rand gave was extended family solidarity all the way to third cousins. So let's assume here that Rand is not talking about the fact that some cultures are much more social than others. So for example, Italian, Greek, and Spanish culture. But instead, let's assume that she means having a family solidarity for functional reasons, like getting jobs or helping relatives in other ways. Is this caused by a lack of conceptualization? Think, for example, of people living in southern Italy, where the rule of law and state were corrupt and relatively weak in protecting the rights of individuals for many centuries. If, as a result, families stuck together more, privileging family members over others, that increased solidarity was not the result of anti-conceptualization, but instead a response to centuries-long governments which were corrupt and weak. Number three, having dealt with these two examples Rand provided, criminal gangs and family solidarity, let's now turn to ask a fundamental question about her basic definition. Is it actually true that tribalists are necessarily anti-conceptual? And the answer is no, not in the slightest. How do we know this? All we have to do is look to the example of Catholicism, Islam, Judaism, and many religions, all of which are tribal belief systems. Crucially, All these religions have theologians whose whole purpose is to conceptualize about why their gods allegedly exist and to deal with the many conceptual issues that arise when people pretend there's a Jehovah, Allah, or Bodhisattva. Are these theologians not religious tribalists, Miss Rand, who have a great loyalty, as tribalists do, to their in-group? Similarly, if we look at secular ideologies like Italian or German fascism or Russian or Chinese communism, we find too that they have their highly conceptualizing counterparts to theologians. Was Marx not tribal? And is not Das Kapital highly conceptualized? How about Hitler? Was he not tribal? And yet wasn't Mein Kampf a conceptualization of his own racist, xenophobic, and nationalistic views? Number 4, so if it's true, as I've argued, that tribalists can be highly conceptual, where does this leave us? Actually, right at the point of understanding what tribalism really is and how it forms. The reality is that, for most part in the modern world, tribalism flows from ideologies, and people who believe in ideologies become tribal, like the Catholics, Muslims, religious Jews, Nazis, and commies I just mentioned. Understanding this, let us thus examine in the abstract the nature of how ideologies form. First, what are ideologies? My definition, departing from the conventional one, is that they are self-deceptive belief systems, distinguished from truth-seeking belief systems, like science and philosophy, by the fact that believers know they are engaging, at least to a degree, in wishful thinking. They know they want to believe something for which there is no evidence, or little evidence. Thus, the self-deception. And how precisely, psychologically and mechanically, does self-deception work? In 2 basic ways. First, according to the philosopher Herbert Fingaret, whose book Self-Deception I reviewed here, it involves the refusal to make something explicit, to spell it out. So, for example, the refusal to spell out the fact that there is no evidence for any God's existence. As a result, the worst thing you can do if you're a Muslim would be to spell out Allah does not exist and Muhammad is not his messenger. Why would saying this be regarded as so evil by Muslims, as it almost always is? Because you're spelling out the truth, which is the worst thing you can do if other people want to deceive themselves and need your cooperative silence. In other words, one of the greatest virtues in any ideology is not to spell out the truth. And that's where the tribalness comes in, the in-groups committed to self-deception. And this exact process applies to secular ideologies as well. And the truths they, too, don't want spelled out. A typical example would be in mainland China today, any criticism of Xi Jinping. If you criticize him, you'll be punished in various ways, as, for example, by losing the ability to use your credit card. But aside from not spelling out, self-deception also involves another second component. And that's obviously the rationalization you replace the truth with. The rationalization that, for example, Allah exists and Mo is his messenger, or that Jesus exists and will cure your cancer, or will save you from all your sins, or that Xi Jinping never makes any serious mistakes and is a great leader of China. And so Muslim or Christian theology or CCP propaganda is about conceptualizing all the rationalizations that the rulers or people want to believe are true. So in this sense, it's not at all anti-conceptual. Number 5. Now, the unfortunate fact is that Rand simply never got this far in understanding self-deception and its relationship to tribalness. Rand mentions racism and xenophobia, but has no understanding that they're part of ideologies, very often supported and funded by the state. So, for example, in the American South, both before and after the Civil War, it was usually very dangerous to life and limb to say that blacks have the same natural rights as whites, or that slavery was bad. Similarly, in modern China, does the CCP not fund and mandate teaching their xenophobic, racist, and nationalist beliefs in all their schools, both K-12 and college? Yes. Here the ideology is created by the rights violations of the state, which incentivize people to engage in self-deception, helped along by the coercive state institutions. So to summarize, an ideology can be formed purely voluntarily, as when a little sect of believers comes together to create their own unique religious cult or QAnon group. But also, for much of history, the majority of ideologies primarily have been caused by rights violations of the state, as can be seen overwhelmingly in the development of Catholicism and Islam and secular ideologies like communism and fascism. The violence and coercion in favor of the approved ideology and against other belief systems incentivizes individual self-deception. And at times, Ms. Rand actually points out this role of the state and its rights violations. However, she thinks it's an effect and not a cause. So, for example, she says, existentially, the rise of the welfare state broke up the country into pressure groups, each fighting for special privileges at the expense of the others. Exactly. The rights violations of the welfare state, stealing from Peter to give to Paul, not anti-conceptualism, created the different roles, the different tribes of self-professed victims. Similarly, she says, today's resurgence of tribalism is not a product of the lower classes, but of the intellectuals, the college-educated elitists. Yes, partly true, but what she misses is that American higher education has become much more public, being enormously funded and controlled by the state since World War II. This control, upon which funding is based, has damaged the academic freedom of the universities, made them much more liberal, and thus indirectly created many of the harmful tribiologies we see today. Trans, woke, postmodernism, feminist, green, CRT, DEI, anti-colonialism, and hatred of the West. In other words, first came the rights violations, the state control and funding of education, or the welfare state, and one thing Rand doesn't mention, the anti-discrimination statutes of the Civil Rights Act, whose effects Richard Hananias describes so well in his book, The Origins of Woke. And then, after the various rights violations, came the anti-conceptualism and tribal ideologies. It's unfortunate for us all, given the enormous readership that Ms. Rand had and continues to have, that she didn't grasp the nature of self-deception, its intimate involvement in creating ideologies, and how those who believe in ideologies become tribal. And it's just as unfortunate that Mr. Brook, the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, repeats her mistakes. I do wonder at times whether he too, like so many orthodox objectivists, hasn't succumbed to some level of his own self-deception regarding Miss Rand's inerrancy in every single instance. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.